How do I learn SQL in 2023? Is it something I should know? These are great questions to ask, especially if you work with C#. Microsoft SQL is a popular database type that is a blend of power, security, and accessibility. In this video, I'm going to cover why Microsoft SQL is special, what order to learn SQL in, and what steps to take to learn most effectively. I will also cover the easy path to learning SQL, as well as some tips and tricks to make the most of your education. Now, if you don't know me, my name is Tim Corey, and I've been a software developer for over 2 decades. I'm a self-taught developer who struggled through all the dead ends, missteps, and conflicting information in my journey to really understanding how to be a great software developer. Now I spend my time trying to make it easier for others. This video is just one of many resources I have to offer. Here on YouTube, I have almost 500 videos around C#, but that includes all the peripheral technologies, including Microsoft SQL Server. So there's a ton of free resources here, as well as if you go to iamtimcorey.com, you'll see a section called resources that will give you even more free resources. There's also paid courses there as well that might benefit you. If you want to be prepared for the real world as a software developer, I can help. Now, before we jump into this, I do want to point one thing out. I hear this quite a bit, and I've already said it both ways, and probably some of you are a little upset. I have said SQL, and I have said SQL. And there are some people who think there's only one correct pronunciation. And I do want to dispel that myth right now. The manufacturers, the maker of Microsoft SQL Server, have said SQL and SQL in the same talk. Also, just so you know, there was a product originally called SQL, S-E-Q-U-E-L, that is kind of the forefather of SQL. So it originally was called SQL, and they shortened to SQL. So just so you know, both pronunciations are fine. Don't die on the hill of pronunciation. Different areas, different regions pronounce things differently. That's okay. Okay, let's jump into why is SQL special? Why is it so special? Let's talk first about the fact that it pairs well with .NET. So if you're a C# developer or F# developer or a VB developer, it pairs well with .NET, and that's because Microsoft creates SQL Server. Now, I am mixing terms here a little bit. I do want to be clear here. SQL, SQL, is a generic term sometimes, but it's also specifically for Microsoft SQL Server. In this video, we're talking about Microsoft SQL Server. There's other types of SQL like MySQL or SQLite, and they use the T-SQL type syntax, but for us, we're focusing on Microsoft SQL. So when I say SQL or SQL, I'm talking about Microsoft SQL database. Okay, so it pairs well with .NET because Microsoft owns both. So they make sure it works really well. And when you work with a company, you'll find that businesses that use Microsoft programming languages tend to use Microsoft databases. Kind of goes hand in hand and makes sense, right? If you're already working with Microsoft on one hand, then you kind of tend to use that on the other. So they work well together. SQL is easy to use, and I do get some pushback, and I understand that. When you first look at it, it can seem complicated, but once you get into it, you'll realize that the core functionality of how it works is actually pretty simple. Now, absolutely, you can dive deep into it. You can have a whole career just on part of SQL Server. However, to actually use it and use it pretty effectively, you can learn it, and it's not that hard. The cool thing is, even though it's not that hard for the basics of how to use it, you can still protect yourself and have a lot of the nice features of security, safety, accessibility, and all the rest of your data without having to have this complex knowledge. Number 4, it can scale. You can use a SQL Server for one person, one application, one little piece, and you can scale up to a global application that has redundancies across the globe that's replicated. Microsoft uses SQL Server for its database for very, very, very large applications. Stack Overflow is famous for using Microsoft SQL Server. Actually, not a really big instance of SQL Server, but that runs all of Stack Overflow. So yes, you can absolutely use SQL for massive organizations and massive databases. So it's not necessarily about the database engine as much as it is how you use it. So if you say, well, it can't go above a size, that's probably because of how you're using it, not because of the engine itself. It has a lot of data security and continuity features. And this is a big one because a lot of people say, well, it's not free. And no, it's not. Now you can get a free version, SQL Express from Microsoft. SQL Express works, I believe, up to a 10 or 20 gigabyte database size, and you can use it in production. So yeah, you can use it for free, but then if you want to get bigger than that, or if you want to have some more features, then you pay for it. It is in Azure, so you can use the Azure version of it fairly cheap, actually. But it's not free, not for the most case. And so people say, well, I'm going to use MySQL, I'm going to use SQLite, or I'm going to use some other variant or database that is free. And I would just caution you here that just because something is free doesn't mean it's the best choice, because what you're paying for sometimes is important. And one of the things that Microsoft SQL Server is really good at is the blend of all the enterprise level features that you need to protect your data with the low price point accessibility for even small organizations to use it. And that's important because at the end of the day, your organization only exists because of your data. That's really the only way it exists. If you didn't have data, you wouldn't know who your customers are. You wouldn't know how much you charge. You'd have no history on it. You couldn't do taxes. All these things would be impossible to do as a business if you didn't have your data. So securing that data should be high on your list. And just using a free thing that might not have all the security features you need, not a good choice. So it has a lot of the security and data continuity features, or has a lot, tons, everything you need, but at the same time, it's also accessible at a low end, and that it can be relatively cheap. So on Azure, there's Azure SQL, which is a SQL Server in Azure. You can get as cheap as $5 per month for a database. Now, I would not recommend that for production, but you can start there. And then you can go to, $20 or $30 a month for a database that potentially could be used in production. And then you can grow from there into, $200, $300, $400 a month, depending. Or you can install it locally, but just know those are also even more expensive with the licensing. So it can be relatively cheap if you know how to work with it. Now, usually the people who are watching these videos, the people who are trying to learn SQL Server, aren't the ones that are going to pay for it. They're the ones that are told by their boss, here's what you're going to do. You're going to use C#, you're going to use SQL. Or we already have a SQL Server. So, in some ways, I get you may not care if it's cheap or if it's got all the features or not, you're told to use it. Cool, that's fine. But I want you to know that it is a great choice for working with any platform, but especially the .NET platform. All right, so let's talk through the learning order of learning about SQL. The very first thing, you need to learn how to set up a database. Now, yes, you may already have one set up for you by somebody else, and so you say, I'm going to skip that because it's already set up. I would encourage you not to. I would encourage you to go back and learn to set up a database because you want to set up your own development database. You don't want to just skip ahead and start working with the cool stuff, because then if you break stuff, how do you restore it? How do you start over? How do you, work on just your machine? What if you get a new machine? How do you set it up? You want to have that base knowledge of here's how I install SQL Server, here's how I configure SQL Server, here's how I create my first database in SQL Server. So knowing how to do that is important. Next up, you should learn about tables. Learn how to create a table, how the tables are designed, the choices to go into building a table. And at first, it seems super simple. It's just, what columns do you want? That's easy, right? So you create a person table, and it just has first name and last name and email address, right? Well, you need to know more than that. You need to know that you should have an identifier, a unique identifier, and typically we call that column ID. We make it an auto-incrementing integer value. You may say, well, Tim, I want to have this be a natural key, which is maybe first name and last name combined. I discourage that. And we can go into more about why that is. The keys that are an auto-incrementing ID provide a lot of value that natural keys do not. So that's getting a little bit down into the weeds. However, it's important to know those things. It's important to know what your primary key is versus a foreign key. It's important to know what choice to make when it comes to which type of text field. Is it varchar, nvarchar? Is it char, nchar? Is it text? What type of text column do you want? And how many characters do you want? And what does that really mean? And so many other things that go into designing and building a table. Spend time learning tables well. And then with that, once you have a table, you can start using basic T-SQL statements, meaning things like select from table. So like select star from table person. Learning how to do that and learning the basics of T-SQL. T-SQL is the language to query the database, to run commands on the database. Technically, you can use T-SQL to generate or create tables or even create a database. So you can do a lot with T-SQL, but learn the basics of it so you know how to manipulate data, how to select which columns you want, how to filter and sort and order and all the rest of the stuff you can do with T-SQL with just basic commands. Once you got that going, then start working through relationships. This is the big thing about SQL is it's a relational database. So if you don't have any relationships, you're probably not doing SQL right, because the whole point of SQL is that it allows for relationships. It allows us to optimize our storage of data. So we only store information once and we link to it instead of storing it multiple times. That allows us to have one primary set of data that is authoritative instead of having multiple sets of data. If you come from a NoSQL background, we put data all over that's the same data in different spots. And you have to know which one's the primary source of truth and which one's not. In SQL, we only have one source of truth because we only have the data stored once. So knowing how to create relationships between tables to say, okay, this person table has a relationship to the address table so that a person can be associated with an address and so on. Indexes. I've already touched on this briefly, but you should know how indexes work. Know what the primary key is, know what the foreign key is, know what that means, what the implications are, what a covering index is, knowing how to add an index and how to drop an index. Indexes are not magic. If you treat them like magic, you will break your database. So when you create an index, if you say, sure, let's create an index, and you don't know what it's doing, it may cause your application, your database, to run slower, even though an index is supposed to optimize your database and optimize your querying ability. So sometimes when you run a query, SQL Server will say, hey, you know what? This would benefit from an index, and here's the index. Just click here to add it. And that sometimes is a good option, and sometimes it is not a good option. So knowing how indexes work and knowing how to optimize them to get the most out of your SQL Server is really important. This is where you can take the same data, the same configuration, and either have a dog-slow database or a lightning-fast database. If you configure your indexes and tune them well, then you can have a lightning-fast database that scales like crazy. Or if you don't configure them well, you can have a database with very few records that just doesn't seem to ever work well. So indexes are important. Going along with that is execution plans. Knowing how SQL gets the information out. Every time you run a query, when you say, hey, I want to get data from these tables, here's the links between the tables, these relationships, and you say, I want to filter on this and sort by this and all the rest. maybe group by, whatever, and you create this query that gets data out of SQL. What SQL does is before it ever gets the data, it first creates a plan, which is a good metaphor for life in general. Before you do something, create a plan. And then what it does is it executes that plan, or it tries to. And sometimes things don't go according to plan. And so it has the execution plan that it thinks it's going to use. And then after it runs, it will give you another execution plan. And that's the actual execution plan, the one that it actually ran. And you can see the differences and see, ooh, there are some differences. And if there's differences, that's an indication you need to look deeper into why there are differences. Because if SQL is expecting one thing and getting another, that's when you know, ooh, we've got to evaluate this better. So learning how to read an execution plan, how to evaluate an execution plan, and then how to make decisions on that plan in order to make changes in your query or changes in your database to better optimize how SQL works is really important. This is where, again, you can really see some huge performance improvements if you know how to read its plans. Views and store procedures. Knowing how to create these two objects, how to design them, how to use them, really important. There's some really cool things you can do with views and store procedures. For example, one of the things I show in one of the videos on YouTube, I have a video on store procedures. And that video shows you how if you decide you want to have a connection string in a WPF application or WinForm application, you have to put the connection string on the desktop where the user can run the application, which means they can potentially have access to your connection string. It's going to happen. If you have a desktop app, they have access to your connection string. Does not matter if you encrypt it or not. So with that means that they have access to your database. And sometimes when people create connection strings to databases, they say, hey, you know what? I'm going to give you admin access because it all works, right? But I show you in that video about store procedures how to create a store procedure which will allow you to execute a T-SQL statement. So select, read, or create, read, update, or delete, a full CRUD statement, whatever. But I show you how to then lock down your database so that a certain user that you can then put in the connection string, that user only has access to certain stored procedures. And that's it. They cannot look at the tables. They can't see which tables are available. They can't read from tables. They can't update or delete tables. They can't call views. They can't do other things in your database. The only thing they can do is call store procedures. And even those you can lock down to only a few of them. That really limits the exposure of your database to your end users. So knowing how to create views and store procedures will really expand your ability to protect your database, to improve the performance of your database, and so many other things. Okay, SSDT. This is one thing that people don't often hear about. If you have Visual Studio installed, one of the options are the database tools options. So when you configured Visual Studio initially, or if you go back to, I believe it's the tools menu, there's the first option to change settings and features. You can select the database options option, and that will install SSDT, or SQL Server Data Tools. And what this allows you to do is to create a database design in Visual Studio like you would a C# project. This means you can put it into source control. This means that you can have it update through CI/CD. This means that you can have refactoring in place so that if you change a column name in a table, you can have that change replicate through all the views and store procedures that also use that column name. So really cool stuff there. I recommend for building databases that you use SSDT. Backup and restore. If you use SQL at all, you need to understand how to back it up and how to restore it. This is imperative. The lifeblood of your company will be your database. Just go to any company and take their database offline for 10 minutes and see what kind of chaos is created. Your company depends on its data. That's the whole reason the company exists, is for that data. So if you don't have it backed up securely and safely, then you're not protecting your company. You're just hoping things work well, and that never goes well. And if you don't restore that backup, you don't know that the restore works or how to do it. So when it comes time to actually restore, you're hoping that you are backing up correctly. Don't hope. Figure it out. And the way to do that is to test those restores. Docker. This is one that people often miss. Docker is an amazing tool. It's for creating containers. I have an intro to Docker on this YouTube channel if you want to check it out to really see more about it. But what Docker allows you to do is it allows you to containerize your database. You can create a SQL server on Linux inside of a Docker container. This allows you to kind of insulate yourself from the SQL Server. Meaning you don't have to install SQL Server on your machine. You can install it in a Docker container, which is a very quick command to run. I also have a video on this channel about taking a backup from SQL Server from production and using it to create a Docker container automatically that is a developer database with scrubbed data. It's automated. It takes little time at all except for the actual restore, but it also tests your restore automatically. That means you're testing your backups to make sure they're working. And your developers get the latest version of the data as close as possible to production so that when they find a bug in production, they can more easily track it down because they usually have close to, if not all of, the data that caused the bug. So Docker is a really valuable tool to have. And then finally, Azure. Knowing how to work with Azure will be very, very valuable. Azure SQL Server is great. It has all the features that you want. And if you want, and this is one of the really cool features I've done before, it's a lot of fun, you can replicate your local on-site database to Azure. So let's say you're just thinking about, well, hey, is that cloud thing going to be anything of value or not? Here's what you do. Replicate your SQL Server in real time from your local on-site database to Azure, to an Azure SQL database. That will keep the Azure SQL database in sync with your local copy. Then, let's just say the worst happens and your server blows up. Like literally, flames come out of the top, it's toasted, the drives are toasted. You can just point all of your clients over to the Azure SQL Server and keep going as if nothing happened. Now, you can keep going with that Azure being the backup, and you can try out, do some tests using the backup instead of the live server. And at some point, you can flip that, where you use Azure as the primary database, and you can replicate down to your local server. Then, if you have a network outage, if you find that it's not fast enough, if you have to make some tweaks, whatever, you can break that replication and point your clients back to the local SQL server. And then at some point, you can say, hey, you know what? We can turn off the local SQL server and just have it in Azure. That's one of the really cool things you can do with Azure. There's so many other things. You can create these elastic pools for your data so that you buy a pool of resources, and then you can put as many databases in that pool as you want. The only thing is they all share the same resources. So if you have one database that only runs at night, maybe it's a data warehouse or something like that, where you transfer things over nightly and it runs some reports, something like that. Well, probably your production database isn't being as heavily used at night, so its usage goes down and the data warehouse usage goes up. Well, you both have access to the same pool, so the warehouse can use 80% if you want, and the primary database can use 20% during the night. And then during the day, the warehouse isn't being used very much, so it goes down to 10% usage, and now your production can use the other 90%. So you can kind of have it, share this pool dynamically as needed for resources. So really cool stuff you can do in Azure with SQL that you really can't do locally with your SQL Server. Makes it a whole lot easier to replicate and so many other things. So that's the learning order for SQL. I do recommend that you learn all of this if you want to work with SQL. This will give you an amazing foundation in working with a database. It gives you so much more information than just, I know how to do select star from. This is going to make you a much more valuable developer. If you're a C# developer or an F# or a VB developer, this is going to make you more valuable because it's not just, I know how to do the basics. It's, I know why the basics are the way they are. I know how to do the advanced stuff. I know how to optimize my code and my database calls to get the most out of our database, to be the most efficient, and to get the best results. So it makes you much more valuable as an employee. Okay, so that's the learning order. Let's talk learning steps. Step number 1, learn a small topic or item. So when you're learning this whole chart of stuff, don't learn it all at once. Learn one small topic or item. If you're going to learn about T-SQL, just start with select statements and figure out how select works and then add in features to it. So build that item 3 separate times. So if you do a select statement, build a select star from person, select first name and last name from person, and select these 5 columns from person. Build 3 separate statements just to make sure you have a handle on the basics. And then use any features or variations at least once. So go back to those 3 and say, okay, I want to put a where clause in one and have a different filter. I want to put an order by in another, and order by a couple different things. And I want to group by in another. And you keep trying these things out and make sure that you understand the variations. Mix and match and play, but at least try 3 different variations and then try as many features or all the features you can that make sense and figure out what they do, how they do it, and make sure you understand really how this works. Once you've done all that, repeat with the next small topic or item. Okay, let's get into the easy path. Now, I sell courses. That's how I keep the lights on. That's how I create all this free content. This free content isn't free. I spend thousands of dollars, actually hundreds of thousands of dollars every year to create free content. And the way I do that is through paid courses. Not everyone can afford paid courses. I don't want you to. If you can't afford it, don't stretch. Don't push. Use my free resources. I have resources on this YouTube channel that will help you learn SQL. Not everything. I can't cover everything, but I cover a lot of stuff. However, if you do have the money, then I do have an easier path. And by easier path or easy path, I mean that I put things in order. I am a consistent voice. I know what you've already learned and I build upon that. I have set things up to make you succeed in the real world, not just to check a box off saying, I've learned how to use SQL, but you don't actually know how to use it. Okay. I teach you practical stuff and I get your hands dirty actually doing it. So the easy path, these are the courses that I offer in this path. Number 1, SQL databases from start to finish. So if you go to imtimcorey.com, you can find this. There's on the all courses page, just do a search for SQL databases. You'll find this. This is going to cover how to install SQL, how to configure SQL, how to build tables, views, store procedures, how to back up and restore your SQL, how to work with security, how to look with indexes, and so many other things in this course. Number 2, database DevOps from start to finish. Now, here's a cool thing. This is the next course to learn. However, if you were to buy the SQL databases course, this next course comes for free with it. Now, if you don't want the first course, then you can just buy the second course. But if you buy the first one, you get both for free. Or, I'm sorry, not both for free. The second one for free if you buy the first one. So the database DevOps from start to finish, what it does is it uses SQL Server data tools. It shows you how to build and construct a database, how to update a database, how to deploy it using Azure DevOps, how to automate the build system, and how to use source control with it, and so many other things around DevOps for your database. And then next, Docker from start to finish. I highly recommend you learn Docker. Docker is a really important tool for working with databases and for working with development databases especially, so that you can easily spin a new database up, try something out, blow it up, no big deal, restart, and away you go. So those three equal the easy path to learning SQL database and getting a good start down the road to understanding SQL well and to being a rock star for your development team. Okay, let's talk tips and tricks. Number one, and again, if you watched any of these other videos, this is hard-coded. Practice isn't extra. It's essential. When you are learning something, you need to get your hands dirty. You need to use it. You need to try it out. I'll go as far as to say you don't learn something until you've actually done it. Yes, you may think you've learned it. Yes, you may even grasp it. But until you've actually done it, you don't know the ins and outs. You haven't verified that it works. You haven't verified that it works in the latest version or in your version or with your configuration or whatever. Practice isn't extra. It's essential to learning. Number two, understand the why. When working with SQL, you shouldn't just know this is what I do. Don't fall into the drone mentality where you just follow in lockstep with whatever tutorial you're watching. Understand the why. Why am I doing it this way? Why is this important? What does this do? I see this a lot with the primary key. People, argue with me over, natural key versus surrogate key. They argue over, well, it can be a GUID or it should be an integer. And they say things because they like them. I like GUIDs. That's not a good answer. Why is it important to use a GUID over an integer? What's the value proposition? What is it going to do for your database? How is it going to improve what you're doing? Is it just because you have a personal preference? That's not good enough. You need to understand the why. Why is it important? So understanding the why is really important. Number three, your goal with a database is efficiency and safety. These are the two really key tenets of working with a database. Is it needs to be efficient. If your database is slow, your application is slow. If your application is slow, your customers go away. So you need to be fast, you need to be efficient. But at the same time, you need to have data integrity, data safety. If you're super fast, but you lose customer records once in a while, you're going to lose customers. That's not okay either. You need to have safety with your database. So when you're building your database, you need to think with those two things: efficiency, safety. How are you doing both? How are you making sure that your data is protected? How are you making sure that your queries are as efficient as possible? Okay, number four. If you haven't restored your backup, you have no backup. Meaning, if you do a backup every single day, but never test it, it's Schrodinger's backup. You don't know if it's alive or dead. I heard a story, and I'm not even sure if it is secondhand or if it was, just apocryphal. But there was a company where they did backups every single night. They were doing partial backups and they were doing full backups every once in a while. And they had this tray where they would have the old tapes and the new tapes. They were using a tape drive for backups. And if you're not familiar with tape drives, be thankful. But a tape drive would do the backup. And so every night they would take the old tape out, the one that's got the full data, they put a new tape in and they rotate through. When it came time where they had a problem and they needed to restore the database, they went to their tapes to get the latest backup and found it was blank. And what they found was they were rotating the same tape and they were actually not doing backups correctly at all. And there was no backups. So they didn't test it. And instead of making sure that, do we have a backup from 2 weeks ago? Do we have a backup from yesterday? Do we have a backup from 3 days ago? And yes, it's important to not just have the last backup, but multiple. Because what if you find out that your data has been corrupted? And it has been corrupted, you find out, for the past 8 hours. And your last backup was 6 hours ago. Well, that backed up corrupted data. So that backup is corrupted. Therefore, you have to do the previous one. Well, when was that one? Well, if you only back up once a week, that's a problem. So you need to have multiple backups, and you need to test all of them, not just every once in a while, not just one of them. You need to have multiple checks to make sure that what you're backing up is what you think it is, and you need to know how to restore that data. Now, I am not saying restore to production. You need to restore to a test database and then verify it and validate it. But you need to do those tests so you know that the backups are working, and you know how to restore in the event of emergency. And then number 5, continually evaluate your biggest resource issues. This is something else I see companies not do. When you have a database, let's say you've designed a database, it's working, it's running, it's in production, life is good. You need to evaluate what your slowest queries are, probably at least once a week. Go in there, SQL Server has options to tell you, here's what is taking up the most resources. And you can look at it in a number of different ways. But you find out what your biggest resource hogs are and figure out how to make them better. You need to do that weekly. Because if you don't, what will happen is things will work fine until they don't. And at that point, you've got a major problem and you don't know what to optimize because you only have a little bit of data because you kept overwriting what the slowest queries were and you didn't optimize. And so you may optimize your first 10, that's all you have access to is the last 10, the 10 biggest ones. So that's better, but it's not good. And you have to wait until that runs for a while to figure out what your next 10 are. Take your time, do it weekly, get the most out of your database. That's going to keep costs low because especially if you're using Azure SQL, the more resources you use, the slower your SQL Server runs because you only have so many resources to use. So if you're more efficient, you can get more customers through for less cost. It really does equal dollars and cents. So it's important to evaluate your biggest resource issues continually. Do it at least once a week, maybe once a month if you are a very, very small system. But do it quite often where you're checking that and optimizing and making changes to make your database more and more efficient. Like I said, SQL Server can power massive global businesses. If your SQL Server can't handle that, it's probably not because your SQL Server is too slow. It's probably because of how you configured it, how you wrote the queries. And I have seen companies that their solution to this is just throw more resources at it. Let's put more RAM in the database or in the server. Let's put more hard drives in, faster hard drives and bigger CPUs. And at some point, you run out of CPU size, you run out of RAM size, you run out of database speed or hard drive speed. You run out of these things. And at that point, you're really stuck. But if you optimize things well, you can head that off much earlier and be able to scale much higher before you start needing those things, truly needing those things. And so therefore you can save a lot of money for your company and really stretch how far you can go before you have to start spending more financially. Okay, so those are my tips and tricks. I definitely recommend that if you don't know SQL, if you're a .NET developer or work with code, I recommend learning SQL Server, learning how to use it. There's free versions for developers. The SQL Server Developer Edition is free, and that's actually the equivalent of their Enterprise Edition. So you can use that for free for development, not for production, but to test things out, try things out. You can get Docker containers in both Windows and in Linux to use SQL Server on. Lots of stuff you can do there. So definitely check it out. Thanks for watching. I hope that you find value in this plan. And as always, I am Tim Corey.